Okay, here's part two of our French Revolution roundup, causes of the French Revolution. So part two is all to do with debt. Now, the French government, the French state, had been accumulating debt throughout the 18th century. Now, they accumulated it in two ways: undertaxing and overspending. So, if you imagine a government has to have enough money coming in to pay for its army, to pay for the bureaucracy, for people to do all the administrative work, and to pay for the lavish lifestyle of the king. The French government was unable to collect large sums of money throughout the 18th century because it had engaged in a particularly unfortunate practice, a thing called tax farming. Tax farming works like this. If you imagine that from 100 citizens you can collect 1,000 livres, and the livre being the unit of currency of the time. But that's going to take a while, and they'll try to avoid paying taxes, as people do, and try to kind of duck and dive around it. Then somebody comes along and says, well, how's about I give you 600 livres right now, okay? And you've got that to spend. And then you give me the right to collect the sum total of the 1,000 livres from those 100 people. That sounds quite tempting. It's a lot less hassle and you get cash right up front. But it also means you only get, say, 60% of the overall tax revenue that you could have had. Does that mean then you think, well, we'd better only spend 60% of the money that we normally spend? No, far from it. It means that the level of spending continues. So this is what the government was doing, that they gave private merchants the right to collect taxes in return for large sums of money up front. But it always meant that the government had less money than it had hoped for. So tax revenues were going down. And the government would tend to sell off the assets that it had that were likely to generate money. Very short term. The other thing that the government did as well is it overspent. So it overspent on royal palaces, it overspent on the lifestyle of the king and the courtiers, and it also overspent on war. Particularly, it overspent on two wars: the 7 Years' War against the British, which France lost from 1754 to 1763, and also France's revenge was its intervention in the American War of Independence, where France sent warships and soldiers to help the American colonists throw the British out of America, thus creating the United States of America, but also bankrupting the French state in the long run because it was a war that France couldn't afford. Now, by the time you get to 1789, there is an enormous budgetary crisis. There is so much debt that France literally cannot afford to repay it without tax rises, significant ones. The way in which the government normally allocate tax rises is is through the government treasury and through the allocation of taxation, but without any vote on the matter. This time, the king realised that the scale of the crisis was so great that he was going to have to find a way of putting the burden of the taxation on the ordinary people, on the third estate, making sure the nobles and the church didn't have to pay, virtually any of it. But in order to do that, he needed to get the third estate to agree to it. And the way to do that most successfully was to call the Estates General. He was urged not to do this. The Estates General being a meeting of the three estates, of representatives of the three estates. He was urged not to do this. Far-sighted people said, well, what will happen is the third estate, which is the vast majority of the country, nearly 90% of the country, they will turn around and say, well, we're not agreeing to anything unless we're represented evenly in the Estates General, i.e. having 90% of the votes. And if they do that, they'll turn around and you'll have a revolution on your hands. And Louis saw no way out of this dilemma. His finance minister previously, Jacques Necker, had produced a fictional account of the nation's finances called the Compte Rendu, which tried to convince the people that France owed money to, France's creditors, that the finances were okay. But when the Compte Rendu turns out to be untrue, turns out to be a fabrication, Necker's in big trouble, and so is the king. And it makes it almost inevitable that the Estates General will have to be called.